The Second Great Awakening, well, after a period, again, of declension, because the impact of the First Great Awakening was short-lived, we have a period of about 60 years or so, and the United States of America, the brand new United States of America, finds itself in a very, very difficult situation. Many of you think that we have entered into a time, a season in our lives that we have never seen before, and it's just simply not true. Let me tell you some of the dynamics that they were faced within 60 years of the First Great Awakening. The country coming out as a brand new country, it was coming out of 8 years of war. They were victorious. I don't know how they were victorious. If you've read the stories of the Revolutionary War, I don't know how they won, other than the providence of God. But they won, but they were a beaten and wounded people. They still had superpowers on their borders. They had France and Spain and England. There was a cessation of hostilities at the end of the Revolutionary War, but there was not a peace. And of course, war would break out again in 1812, as you know. And so they lived under the threat of war, the constant threat of war, sort of like what South Korea is facing right now with the North. They faced also pirates and terrorists. The pirates off their coast, once they were free from England, they were now then fair game for anyone on the open seas. So the commerce coming out of the United States, trying to get to Europe for the markets, were often pirated, taken by Britain because they believed the ships belonged to them anyway, and the crews and the cargo too. And the French would do the same. So instead of going to the north to Europe, they would try the southern route into the Mediterranean. And there they faced Muslim terrorists, Muslim pirates off North Africa, who were taking our ships, taking our cargo, and holding our crews for ransom. And in fact, between 1790 and 1800, during that decade, up to 20% of the entire federal budget was being used to pay for Muslim pirates off North Africa to get our crews home. The country was near bankruptcy. And if it wasn't for the eloquence and the strength of Alexander Hamilton, we would have defaulted on our foreign obligations. There was a real estate collapse, much like 2008, but many people lost their entire fortunes. There were plagues and famine. Yellow fever was taking thousands, and tens of thousands were dying of various kinds of diseases. In fact, the capital was in Philadelphia at the time, and they were so diseased along the Delaware River that they thought the Delaware was the source of the diseases. So they were picking up the capital and moving it over into Trenton, New Jersey, if you remember your American history. There was famine as well because there were diseases among the crops and the fruit plants. There were grave national doubts as to whether the American phenomenon could in fact exist, and one of those doubts arose out of the onslaught of the awakening, the philosophical onslaught of the awakening, but also attended to with the reign of terror in France. France had thrown off its monarchy. It had also thrown off its church. And upwards of 40,000 members of the church in France were killed, were essentially executed, mass slaughter. Some of them were killed wholesale in front of cheering public. There was social unrest in the United States. The government was sending out federal troops into certain major metropolitan areas to quell anarchy and rebellion. There was the other plague of universalism and Unitarianism coming from England and from Europe, and it was gobbling up the churches of America. There was a nasty, nasty election, national election. It was principally between Jefferson and Adams, although the last two candidates were not Jefferson and Adams, but principally those two candidates. And the church was so convinced that Jefferson was so evil, the evangelicals of the day, that they considered him not only either the Antichrist or the prophet of the Antichrist. And in fact, there was a political movement that was able to mobilize at least 2% of the national vote to vote for Jefferson in that election, to get him into the presidency, because they were convinced if he would win the presidency, he would hasten the return of Christ. So there was a coarse sensuality throughout the land as well. Anti-Christian fever on the campuses. The people on the campuses were hiding when they met in their secret societies, devoted to Christ. They keep their minutes secret because they were afraid of the harassment of their fellow classmates. Bible burnings as well on the campus. The churches were empty too. The pastors were writing to each other. They couldn't understand. They had never seen an American church like it was in this condition. And in fact, there was one journalist, a French journalist, who rode through the entire length of Virginia. And in his memoirs, he could not find through the entire length of Virginia a single church that was either abandoned or in disrepair. They were either abandoned or in disrepair. And then the most horrific of sins upon the land was slavery itself. We have faced very, very difficult times before. Now, what the people did during that time, it really depends on your outlook, your theological outlook. And if you do not have a very good view of history and the unfolding of God's graces in history, well, you're going to give up, you're going to circle your wagons, you're going to protect your young, and you're just going to ride it out until Jesus comes again. But in fact, there was a sense of optimism within the theology of this day, and they knew that the next great work of God was going to be the greatest work ever. And they prayed with confidence, and they began mobilizing each other to pray. And they moved themselves through not only the mid-Atlantic states and up into New England. There were calls to prayer by the Baptists. Bacchus up in New England was calling for united prayer and concerted prayer, and going back to Edwards, redigging the wells of the past and saying, let's go back to what we knew God responded to. They'd go back theologically. They'd go back in practice. And the concert of prayer was reinvigorated once again. And these covenants of prayer on Saturday night, praying for the outpouring of God's Spirit the next day in church. Once a month in fellowship, in societies of prayer, and then once a quarter in fellowship with other churches of like mind. And they had this heartbeat within the church that was praying and seeking God for the outpouring of His Spirit. And there were people who saw revivals taking place, and some of them here, right in the Carolinas, North and South of Carolina, but also up in Virginia. And out of these revivals here, men were then trained to go into the frontiers and to take the gospel into the frontiers to plant churches. And they went out of North Carolina. They went out of South Carolina. They were called the Wild Men of the Cumberland. They went out to plant churches and preach the gospel. And they entered into these covenants of prayer with the churches that they planted. And out into the places like Kentucky, especially, they began not only these concerted prayer efforts, once a month, once a quarter, once a year, at the sacrament of the Lord, where they celebrate communion together, and these crowds began to grow, and these crowds began to grow. And in 1800 and 1801, the crowds began to be magnificent, and the outpourings of God's Spirit absolutely breathtaking, until Cane Ridge in 1801, in this place. I still can't believe God used Cane Ridge. Can you? I mean, it's up in the middle of nowhere. It's still in the middle of nowhere. And yet this enormous crowd came, and God poured out His Spirit in such ways that if we were to tell the stories today, we just simply wouldn't believe them, although maybe we would. And from that Cane Ridge revival, then the revival spread. And let me just take you to the highlights. So just to give you a glimpse of hope, and if you want the full story, you can go to onecry.com, onecry.com, and many of these resources are there, and the full story of this revival is there. But this revival broke out upon the scene and spread for nearly 50 years. It galvanized whole populations within the United States of America. These disparate groups of people now galvanized into people who were feverish for the work of the gospel. Tens of thousands of churches were planted and launched in various denominations. Hundreds of denominations and associations were founded. Hundreds of colleges and universities sprang out of this revival. Thousands of schools were planted too, and the education of our young. Hospitals were established. They were evangelical Christians who were establishing these things. Modern missions was founded. And the spread of the gospel that, as we know it today, all kinds of societies, American Bible Society, the sending out of missionary societies, the support of mission societies, the mission societies for the poor and for the orphan, on and on the societies, the list of societies went. The birth of abolition. Many of the people who were involved out on the frontier, who were involved in this Great Awakening and the Cane Ridge revivals, these wild men of the Cumberland that went out into the frontiers to preach the gospel, many of them were involved in the Underground Railroad, even as the revival was going on. And Cane Ridge itself was a center of abolitionism, right in the heart of the frontier South. And the effects are still with us today, these evidences. Remarkable. The hope is with us. God has seen such days before, as has the church, and he has worked his marvelous purposes.
Amen. Bob, before you go there, I know that there was somewhat of a cultural difference in the first Great Awakening, the second Great. Whitefield, he was a scholar, he was an intellectual, yet these wild men of the frontier, it was more of a pioneer thing. Can you speak to the cultural difference between the two?
Yeah, I think we do them a disservice to consider them. I mean, some people think, this revival was among the inhabitants. Have you seen the movie Deliverance? They think while it happened because there were these silly people out in these places, but they weren't. The populations out in Kentucky, out on the frontier, came out of the Mid-Atlantic states principally. The population of Kentucky tripled in the decade of the 1790s because people were leaving now the farms. Farmers didn't have any place to go. There were better farmlands out to the west. They went out, they came. Many of them were educated. Many of them were sophisticated, in fact. And those who were trained to go out and plant churches were done so by very studious men like David Caldwell here in the Carolinas. They were trained, and they were wonderfully gifted men and theologically sound, Presbyterians. And they were ordained Presbyterians. They didn't reap the benefit of the revival. The Presbyterians didn't. The Methodists did, and the Baptists. Now, if you want to talk about the Baptists, we'll talk about. But anyway, but I think we do them a disservice if we think that they were just simple people, very distinct from maybe Whitefield and Wesley.
I think one of the most fascinating things, Bob, you've spoken about before, is David Caldwell's influence. He was the man, wasn't he? That,
yes, he was.
That discipled, trained these 5 wild men of the Cumberland.
That's right.
We know of this great movement. We don't know much about David Caldwell. Yet
Right.
his discipling of these men and developing of these men was the instrument God used.
Just like the Tennant brothers up in New Jersey,
Yeah.
very similar at Log College, but they were frustrated with the standard education that they were getting and wanted people who knew God and knew the power of God. And they knew that they had tasted revival in the Carolinas and Virginia, and so they went into the frontier, their clothes sort of smelling the smoke of revival, and they knew what a manifest presence of God looked like.
And it just gives us hope that it could be, well, I may not be in the middle of the revival later, but I could train somebody.
That's right.
I could be used that way. You've told us before about, I think it's Mark Knoll at Notre Dame, his
Right.
statement about the Second Great Awakening.
Yeah, Mark Knoll, head of the Church American History at Notre Dame, he's unimpressed with the First Great Awakening, and he's unimpressed with the prayer revival in 1857. We're not going to speak to it today. But he says the Second Great Awakening changed the course of world history. Mm-hmm. And that was the first truly American, as a nation, national religious experience that we had. And we cut our teeth there. And it has left its imprint upon us. So.
Amen.